I want to thank Andrew for inviting me and arranging the conference, and to Mary Scott and to Whitney for all the hard work that they've done for this, and to Bob and Patrick of the American Philosophical Society for their support for this. Some people have come up to me and said, well, you're going to summarize everything that's been said and bring it all together, right? And I've always wanted to give an 8-hour talk. So I'm not going to do that. You'll be relieved to know. Some people have also asked me about this pin, and it's a Jeffersonometer. So when you say nice things about Jefferson, he's upright. So the talks about architecture or medicine, he was fully upright. But when you talk about slavery, Jefferson goes like that. So it's entirely within your power as to whether Jefferson is up or down. I've done something very subversive here. You're wondering, you're looking at that and saying, which pavilion is that? I'm sorry that this is mostly going to be about William and Mary. I am writing a book which is about education and the impact of the American Revolution on the politics and the social relations of education. So it's about students, it's about teachers, and it's about politicians. And the visions that people have for society, which they try to forward by rearranging education. And I want to begin with these two men. On the left is John Randolph, who will become quite a celebrated politician, principally in Congress. And on the right is Robert Barad Taylor, no relationship, was a very prominent lawyer in Norfolk. So these are adult pictures. But in February of 1793, they were both students at William and Mary when they decided to shoot each other. And the dispute began over a word and the pronunciation of the word. And each of them thought that he was completely correct about the proper pronunciation. I suspect this came out in one of these debating societies, which Carolyn talked about, which were so central to education at William and Mary. And William and Mary was the only institution of higher education when the Revolution began. There were a couple of Presbyterian schools that get established during or shortly after the Revolution in Hampton-Sydney and then what is now Washington and Lee, but they are both much smaller and less prestigious. And the Virginia elite, after the American Revolution, is still primarily being trained at William and Mary. So these two young men have a dispute over the pronunciation of the word. Randolph, as was his habit, insulted Taylor, so Taylor challenged him to a duel. In the duel, on February 6, 1793, they shot at each other. Randolph proved to be the better shot and put a bullet, quote, in the right side of the right buttock of Taylor, where it remained for the rest of Taylor's life. Now, this seems like a timeless episode because we sometimes interpret dueling and the code of honor as something that's very deeply rooted in time and continuous. But what I've found is quite surprising is that duels virtually did not exist in colonial Virginia. And it's a question, why is it that they were virtually unknown in the colonial era, and yet they proliferate in the immediate wake of the American Revolution? And I think this is quite revealing. I do think that the religious culture of Virginia, which we often sell short in the colonial period, in fact was an inhibiting factor. And one piece of evidence for this comes in 1767 when Arthur Lee does challenge another gentleman, James Mercer, to a duel in Williamsburg. And most people are just going, what's a duel? This is outrageous. And the newspaper just makes fun of Lee, mocks him for this, for promoting a future, quote, where the laws of honor will take place and flourish on the ruin of all other laws. So at that point in time, to challenge somebody to a duel seemed alien, it seemed inhumane, and above all, it seemed impious, that you would take into your own hands the life and death of another person. Now, Lee had learned about dueling because he had attended school at Eton. and had rubbed shoulders with the sons of aristocrats. So this was a custom that was much better developed in Britain, and it comes to the United States in a big way when we might paradoxically think it would not, and that's during the Revolution. And the vehicle for it is the Continental Army, where you have a lot of young men from diverse places and diverse backgrounds being thrown together and competing for rank and honor. And they have lots of disputes, and they decide rather than have endless court-martials that they would start in this very formal way shooting at each other and proving that they're every bit as honorable as their British counterparts. And from the Continental Army, it spreads when these officers go homeward, and they will teach it to their children and to their neighbors, and it takes root most deeply in the South. And it becomes closely associated with slavery. Now, this is a bit of a controversy. Bertram Wyatt Brown argued that this is really more of a timeless culture thing, whereas Ed Ayers and others have argued for the close association with slavery of the Code of Honor. And I am taking that side of the debate here. And young men learn from their parents to be very touchy about their honor, to detect insults in words, and to be prepared to punish those insults if not corrected. And out of the Revolution, you get a society which is less publicly pious, particularly for the genteel class, is much more overtly individualistic, and is much more competitive. So the sons of the gentility have a sense that things are no longer handed to them by inheritance to the same degree that they had been in the colonial era. And they perceive that they have to compete with one another, and particularly in the realm of law. The guiding elite in Virginia will increasingly become a legal elite, particularly at the very highest levels, to a greater degree than in the colonial era. And lawyers are people who deploy the written and spoken word, but particularly the spoken word, in contentious conditions. And young men who are going away to college in Virginia are primarily trying to learn how they can be lawyers, even if they will not practice the law and instead will go back to their plantation, as was the case with John Randolph. And so it's a society that is more competitive, more individualistic. It is less pious for the genteel class, and it allows for the proliferation of this honor culture among people who insist that their privilege to govern society derives from their capacity to manage and own other human beings. And slaves are being defined as people who are utterly without honor. There is this conceit that the enslaved have somehow colluded in that by not resisting to the death their enslavement. At the same time, these very same people who are putting out this canard are also deathly afraid of slave revolt. But they believe this canard, and the other side of the coin is that if you therefore enjoy freedom, you must be willing to fight for it, even against other gentlemen, if they've insulted you. And to take an insult is to behave slavishly. And so students will go off to school, particularly at William and Mary, where they are primarily trying to hone social skills and develop social networks, and only secondarily to develop intellectual abilities. Students valued fashionable attire, elegant posture, polished manners, generosity at buying drinks, witty conversation, and prowess at cards. One student exhorted a peer to cultivate, quote, a familiar ease of manners and conversation, which in a man's flight to fame is what wings are to birds. The greatest talents and learning can hardly ever succeed in this Republican country without polished manners. and with it, they as seldom fail of success. And you find parents saying the same thing. It's not just peers saying this to one another. Gentile parents wanted their sons to gain enough education to seem polished, without absorbing too much to become dull. Sterling Ruffing exhorted his son Thomas to be, quote, attentive to your books, but particularly so to your manners. A man may be better read than his neighbor and yet not quite acquire half the respect if the other should be more accommodating, end quote, in his manners. Parents worried that overly studious students would become sickly and asocial, too much like their professors. And gentile parents wanted their sons to develop a robust sense of honor. And this was a very fine line, where on the one hand they're to be studiously polite to others, to avoid saying something that's insulting if they can, but they must never, ever display submission to another person. David Watson advised his son to avoid, quote, contending with warmth about trifles. But he added, be careful of your health and your limbs, but do not be fearful and cowardly when it is necessary and proper to expose them, end quote. In other words, he would rather see his son risk life and limb than to stomach an insult from another. It's also a factor that they've grown up in households where there are sisters and usually a mother and often aunts. They've been in a world in which they've been both genders. And now they are going to a realm which is, with the exception of enslaved people around them, is entirely masculine. The professors are masculine. Their other students are all masculine. They are at an age which is hyper-competitive. One critic of student culture said this, quote, when multitudes of youth are brought together and for the first time separated from all the powerful restraints of virtuous female society and all the kindly influences of domestic life, ardent, highly excitable, confident in their numbers, and fully united by the esprit du corps, they require as much courage and skill to govern them as a mighty army, end quote. And so these people have been raised by, especially by their fathers, to be defiant, to brook no insult, to show that nobody else is their superior. You can just imagine when they go into schools, particularly as they're getting older and they're off at a college, that they are going to be damn difficult to order around, to get them to try to change their behavior in any way. In other words, the South in general, but particularly Virginia, has developed in the wake of the Revolution a culture of youth that is particularly resistant to authority of others, because they believe that that resistance is what will make them able to command the people that they expect to command in their future lives. And the two great battle lines at William & Mary and other schools is, first, students insist they have a right to duel, that they are old enough to duel and that they have to duel to defend their honor. Whereas college authorities are saying, we think dueling's a bad idea, probably in all circumstances, but it's especially so because you're teenagers. Although, of course, nobody ever used the phrase teenager at that time. But that you're not old enough, you're under, your parents have entrusted you to us and we can't allow you to duel. The irony is that the parents, the fathers anyway, usually want their sons to be able to duel in order to defend their honor. The second fault line is with the community of Williamsburg, in that these young men often feel collectively insulted by something that some townsman has done to one of these young men, and they want to punish the town. And they would punish it in a form of rioting that they called setting the town to rights. And there are certain common features to it. One is to make as much noise at night as you possibly can to wake everybody up. This often involves musical instruments. It means breaking into the parish church to ring the bell. It means just beating on fences, tearing down fences, tearing down gate posts, tearing down signs from businesses, pulling out carts, outhouses, building a barricade in the midst of the street, and smashing windows. It's not like this happens every day, but it happens periodically. And people in Williamsburg expected that if this only happened once a year, they got off lightly. Now, this turbulence becomes an issue in a national culture war that pivots on Thomas Jefferson. And Americans are not in the habit of electing philosophers as their presidents. And this becomes an issue in the presidential election of 1800. Federalists derided Jefferson's learning as showy but silly. In a July 4, 1799 oration, a Connecticut Federalist mocked Jefferson's science as folly by entitling the speech, quote, "Sunbeams may be extracted from cucumbers, but the process is tedious." But they cast his philosophy as more than just idiotic, but as menacing. That Jefferson was somebody who had no reverence for tradition, no reverence for institutions that maintained order in society, and therefore that if Jefferson was elected, it would throw all social relations into chaos because of Jefferson's insistence on knowledge should be experimental, it should be progressive, and therefore you should accept nothing on the basis of tradition. And so they thought that Jefferson's election, or at least they told voters that Jefferson's election would bring in the kind of atheism and chaos and bloodshed associated with the French Jacobins. Now, while Federalists defended the past, Jefferson was very happy to claim the future. He assured a William and Mary student that the human, quote, mind is perfectible to a degree of which we cannot as yet form any conception. And he derided, quote, as cowardly the idea that the human mind is incapable of further advances. Now, it's very bold for him to use the term perfectible. And what this resonates with is a particular book that had become notorious in the 1790s in the United States, written by an English author, William Godwin, called Political Justice. And Political Justice was the great kind of forbidden classic that young men in particular like to read because it cast doubt on all forms of tradition, including the family, including marriage, and suggested that human beings were perfectible if they would just discard tradition. And this is William Godwin. Now, Godwin becomes along with Jefferson, the great antichrist in the eyes of the Federalists. That the two of them, they like to link them together, particularly any time Jefferson would use the word perfectible, suggested that this was very Godwinian. And the Federalists like to put out the idea that William Godwin's Political Justice was the core text taught at William and Mary, which it wasn't. It was available there, but it largely was available, the students would circulate it amongst themselves. It's not really being taught. But in the Federalist newspapers, they cast William and Mary as the place where William Godwin is the core text. Now, the president of William and Mary, in order to confuse everybody ever since, was named James Madison. But he's not that James Madison. He's the cousin of James Madison. And people usually called him Bishop Madison because he is the bishop of the Episcopal Church. But he is a very latitudinarian Episcopalian. And he is utterly ineffective as a bishop and largely ineffective as a minister. And he's much more interested in scientific experiments and in running the College of William and Mary. And he's actually quite a good friend with Thomas Jefferson and with Madison's cousin, James Madison. And he is often doing damage control. And so when the Federalists are publishing in their newspapers that William and Mary is this den of atheism where Godwin's political justice is taught every day, he goes into print and he advances a very Jeffersonian defense of it all. He says it's not mandatory, it's not taught, but that William and Mary offered, quote, a system of rational education calculated to disseminate truth in morals and politics and to form wise and virtuous citizens. Now, in early 1802, however, the students discredited Madison's case for their wisdom and virtue. In February, 2 students fought a duel. One suffered a minor wound. The faculty ousted both of them. This is the first expulsions of Bishop Madison's regime. College of William and Mary was financially strapped, and it was dependent on tuition paid by students, so they couldn't afford to kick out students, so they're paying customers. So they, despite all sorts of turmoil, they never kicked out any students until this one episode. And the reason why Bishop Madison is kicking them out now is because there's national attention that has been shown on William and Mary, and he's trying to demonstrate that, in fact, college authorities are in control of the situation. Not so. The situation gets completely out of hand because the students are shocked that 2 young men would be kicked out for having engaged in a duel. They demand that the 2 students be reinstated. When the faculty refused to reinstate them, then they rioted. They went into the town and they smashed the windows of all of the professors who had voted to discipline the young men. And they included St. George Tucker, this is St. George Tucker here, who was the most prestigious member of the faculty. He was the law professor at the time. To be thorough, they also targeted the college chapel and the village parish church, which had been the targets of previous riots. There is an aggressive group of young men among the college students who are critics of organized religion, and particularly of John Bracken, who is the parish minister and also one of the professors. So by attacking Bracken's church, you are killing 2 birds with 1 stone. You're punishing a professor who has voted against your interests, and you are smashing at organized religion. And so they went into the college chapel and the village parish church to tear apart Bibles and prayer books. Now you can just imagine how much the Federalists in New York and New England loved this story, that at Thomas Jefferson's college, where he had attended as a student, where, unlike northern institutions, the students are overwhelmingly pro-Jefferson Republicans, where they have openly admitted that they read William Godwin's Political Justice, that students have gone on a rampage and smashed the professor's windows and torn up Bibles and prayer books and otherwise vandalized a church, is too good to be true, except it is true. The New York Evening Post warned, quote, "Thus dies one of the oldest and wealthiest seminaries of learning in the United States of America. These may be considered as some of the blessed effects of the modern or Jeffersonian system of religion," end quote. So for the Federalists, it's ideal because it discredits the perfectibility of human nature and suggests that if you take away religious infrastructure, this is what young men will do. Now again, Bishop Madison has to engage in damage control by posing as an impartial observer in an anonymous newspaper essay. So it's not just Jefferson who does this. There's a long tradition of people doing this. He correctly reported that the college had not closed, in fact, but he misled by insisting that the riot only involved 5 or 6 students. Now, while the bishop is publicly announcing that this was just a very small affair, nothing to be concerned about, the Board of Visitors privately assembled in crisis session and adopted stricter new rules. And it's part of this common phenomenon that you find at colleges and universities in this decade, which is that authorities are trying to tighten their rules by eliminating what they see as the social contexts that breed defiance. So parties and balls and gambling and going to taverns, all of these things. So they're trying to shift the battle lines out of the college and into spaces that the students have considered their own spaces that are generally off campus. But what they do when they do that is they're just upping the ante. They're just creating a more difficult set of battles, which the faculty are not well prepared to fight. The faculty tend to be older. They're not as spry as these young guys. And the students then take it upon themselves to try to demonstrate that they can engage in these behaviors under the very noses of the faculty, often in disguise, in order to show who really is calling the shots at these places. And this is what happens at William and Mary. Evidence of this happens in March of 1808, when students vandalized the college and threatened the bishop and his home after an attempt to suppress drunken parties and balls. Ellen Randolph, granddaughter of Thomas Jefferson, informed her grandfather, quote, "There's been a terrible riot at Williamsburg. 15 boys were expelled and 5 thrown in jail and fined $20 apiece." They had to call out the militia to patrol the streets. Now, this particular episode divided the students. There was a small minority of them that actually helped to defend Bishop Madison's house. One of them was a young man named Samuel Myers from Norfolk, the son of a very wealthy merchant. And Myers denounced his riotous peers as having, quote, "arrived at a state of depravity and insensibility," end quote. He also said that he was going to be reformed and that he would only engage in dissipated company no more than 2 or 3 times a week. He's being serious. He's not being funny. He also cherished the friendship of this young man, William C. Somerville, who was his housemate. Quote, "A better one I believe I could not have possibly chosen. He's genteel, comes from a very wealthy family," and they shared, Myers announced, quote, "the same desire and intention of applying closely to our studies and avoiding company as much as possible," end quote. 3 months later, however, Myers wrote to his father, quote, "Several insults which I had received from Somerville compelled me on Saturday morning to call on him for an explanation," end quote. So they go to the edge of town, and Somerville refuses to apologize to Myers, so Myers provides some pistols and says, "Okay, let's have a duel," but he's kind of botched it because they haven't brought any seconds along. And so Somerville says, "I'm not fighting you a duel without seconds." So then Myers goes back to the college and puts up notices posting Somerville as a coward. Well, since it's against the rules to engage in a duel, to post somebody in this way and sign your name to it is just an invitation to be kicked out of William and Mary, which is what happens to Myers. Or at least, no, in fact, in the end, he's not kicked out, but he is compelled to post bond to keep the peace. This shows how honor culture could divide the best of friends and cast even dedicated students on a deadly path. This college suffered from these violent episodes of duels and riots, as well as just a general dissipation. Enrollment stagnated at about 50 students. This is 2/3 of the peak that the college had enjoyed, which was in early 1802, just before this dramatic riot that had attracted national attention. At 50 students, this means William and Mary is 1/3 of the size of the student body at Princeton, Harvard, or Yale. So Virginia is failing to educate its own sons, and many of them are going off to northern institutions, principally to Princeton, because of this. And it's dividing parents. Some parents don't want to send their sons to William and Mary because they're from a kind of Federalist orbit, or they're more pious, and they just think it's a very irreligious place. But other parents increasingly are not sending their sons because they think the rules there are too strict. and are dishonoring their sons who go there by not allowing them to duel and by compelling them to be informants. So there are rules at the college that if you are asked a question in a formal hearing of the faculty in the blue room, you have to answer the question. If you don't answer the question, and the questions may be, do you know of any of your peers who have engaged in any of these long lists of behaviors? So the students hate that, and they refuse to cooperate overwhelmingly. And they regard it as the most dishonoring thing that could be asked of them is to inform on another student. So this becomes a great flashpoint at William and Mary. The college's decline accelerates after Bishop Madison dies in 1812. And he's succeeded by, of all people, John Bracken. John Bracken is he's a controversial figure. He's not very capable. Jefferson makes a great deal out of the very slow degree to which Bracken had embraced the American Revolution and his conspicuous support for the Federalists in order to call Bracken, quote, a Tory and a simpleton. But in December of 1812, there's an attempted coup where Jefferson's friend Cabell, Joseph C. Cabell, who has an interest in the college and is also an alum, tries to push out Bracken and bring in, of all people, Peter Carr, who is Jefferson's nephew. But then Jefferson tells Carr that would be a big mistake because William and Mary is beyond reform and you just want to stay here in Albemarle County. So he does, and Bracken stays on as president for another 2 years. But in those 2 years, the number of students dwindles down to 21, and the number of faculty dwindles down to just 1. So finally, the Board of Visitors say enough is enough, and they push him out, and they bring in this man, John Augustine Smith, who is a Virginian, but he's gone off, he's a medical doctor, he's gone off and he's been a professor at what is now Columbia University, and he comes back to his native Virginia. And this is in older years, but he's got the energy of relative youth when he comes to William and Mary, and he's going to try to reform everything. And he rejects the popular belief, quote, that young Virginians were absolutely uncontrollable, that they sucked in with their mother's milk such high-spirited notions as to be ever after ungovernable. He also said, quote, he would much prefer that the faculty should be ourselves the sole occupants of this venerable pile than to see it crowded with a lawless host of ungovernable students, end quote. Well, he nearly succeeded because he kicked out 77 students over the first 10 years as president. This is about a fifth of the total attending, and more than twice as many who had been ousted during the previous 30 years. And this is a great sacrifice to an institution that depends on student fees. And indeed, when a student got kicked out, their fees would be reimbursed to them. So the college is not keeping it. Now, initially, Joseph Cabell, this is not Joseph Cabell, but this is his brother, William Cabell. Joseph Cabell's impressed by Smith's energy, his determination to reform William and Mary, to reform young men. But this is put to the test when William Cabell's son, Nicholas, will go to William and Mary in 1816 and will promptly become involved in another one of these abortive duels, which he has a pistol, he menaces another student, faculty intervene, they kick out William Cabell's son. Now, William Cabell's a former governor of the state of Virginia and an accomplished lawyer. And his response is not to be upset about his son having brought a pistol in and menacing another student. He's upset because his son has been kicked out and now the gossip is shaming the family. And he vindicated Nicholas in a public statement as he'd done this to, quote, avoid the degradation of being caned, which is to hit somebody with a cane, which is a real way to shame them. And so would any other man, whatever professors as such may say to the contrary. And he then vowed, quote, I shall never place another son under the guardianship of men who are capable of such injustice. So this is the background then when Thomas Jefferson is in the process with Joseph Cabell and others of trying to found the University of Virginia. Now, student turmoil is widespread in the country. This is Nassau Hall, and Princeton was notorious as among northern institutions to be the one most prone to riots. It's also the institution which has the highest proportion of Southern-born students, approximately a third every one of these years. And people didn't think it was coincidental. And the ringleaders of the riots, and most of those who then are expelled from the college, tend to come from the Carolinas or from Virginia. Thomas Jefferson said of Princeton, he, quote, held in great contempt as the most licentious and unruly seminar on the continent. But it was even worse at more southern institutions. And UVA is not the first public southern university. There were southern universities in South Carolina, Georgia, and North Carolina. And North Carolina and South Carolina are particularly tumultuous. The father of a student at UNC, when his son kind of boasted that UNC was the most dissipated, profane, and defiant in the land, said, no, the dissipation you speak of pervades all the states where slavery abounds. Were you conversant with the habits of South Carolina or Georgia University, you would find darker traces there than at Chapel Hill, end quote. South Carolina was probably the worst of all the universities. To rile the professors, South Carolina students engaged in a behavior called black rides, and it's a very revealing name. In black rides, they would blacken their faces, they would steal horses of faculty members, they would mount them, and carrying flaming torches, they would ride around the campus hooting and hollering to call the attention of the faculty that this was going on. And when the faculty would try to intervene, then they would dismount and disappear in the ranks of their peers. This, again, is an effort to demonstrate the impotence of the professors to do anything about it. This man was probably the best positioned of anyone in America to judge the behavior of Southern students and to compare it with Northern students. It's Thomas Cooper. We've talked quite a bit about Thomas Cooper in various presentations here. He had taught in Pennsylvania for many years, and then he will become the president of South Carolina College. In February of 1822, he reported to his very good friend Jefferson that the students had stolen his horse for a black ride, broke his house windows, and even fired guns to startle him. He attributed the defiance and dissipation to the parental indulgence in their early training as masters of slaves. Quote, in my own opinion, the parental indulgence to the South renders young men less fit for college government than the habits of the Northern people, and the rigid discipline of the Northern seminary must be put in force inexorably in the South. Now, Jefferson also feared this disorder. I should just do one more thing. This shows the pattern of enrollments, and you can see where Thomas Cooper is. He's second on the list, and this is like the all-time low for the college. It's even lower than something called the Great Biscuit Riot. So you know you're really doing poorly as a college president when the Great Biscuit Riot doesn't put an even greater dent in student enrollment. Jefferson wrote back to Cooper, and he said, you know, UVA, and this is 1822, so UVA hasn't opened yet. And he's still struggling to get money. And he says, there are two great challenges here. The first of them is to get money out of a legislature. And we heard quite a bit about that. But he says, but a second, a greater, and a more desperate one is the spirit of insubordination and self-will which seizes our youth so early in life as to defeat their education, and the too little control exercised by indulgent parents, end quote. He worried that this student turmoil would ruin the new university. Quote, I look to it with dismay in our institution as a breaker ahead, which I am far from being confident we shall be able to weather. The article of discipline is the most difficult in American education. Premature ideas of independence, too little repressed by parents, beget a spirit of insubordination, which is the great obstacle to science with us and a principal cause of its decay since the Revolution. Now this is not the Jefferson we're used to hearing. Somebody who speaks of premature independence, who talks about the decay of education. We associate him with confidence in the people and a serene belief in progress. But he has his eyes open and he knows what's going on. And his confidence in the people is generally in an imagined future improved people who will be improved through education. The problem is that parental behavior toward their children, in his view, and again, he's just talking about the genteel class, but they are the leadership class as he imagines it, and is the reality in the Virginia of that day. They have been so prepared by poor parenting and by the ownership of slaves that they are incapable of being properly educated. Now, that doesn't mean Jefferson despairs. It just means that when he designs the University of Virginia, he has this student disorder in mind in almost every feature of it. He is trying to strengthen the firm hand of authority within a velvet glove, lulling students into a more dutiful attention to their education. He is very devoted, of course, to the Enlightenment. So this means he has a great confidence that if you can just find the right combination of rules, of teachers, and of buildings and their arrangement, that you can change behavior. And this is one of the major reasons why he breaks with the one big college building and has the academical village. There are aesthetic and technical reasons to analyze his decision to do this, but there are also social reasons. He believes this will disperse the students among the faculty, and the faculty that will then be in the position from their lofty pavilions to look down on and control the students. He said, quote, "It would afford that quiet retirement so friendly to study and lessen the dangers of fire, infection, and tumult. Every professor would be the police officer of the students adjacent to his own lodge," end quote. This also informs his decision to recruit European professors. There are a variety of reasons for it, but one of them is he believes they will come in with a mystique. He believes people won't already know who they are. The students will tend to take direction from them much better than if they were Americans and thought to be second-rate figures. It also informs his decision to subcontract the feeding of students out to hotels, because one of the great flashpoints, as with the Great Biscuit Riot, was how bad the food was. So this shows the dispersion of the pavilions among the dorms. It also informs the rules that he has for students. And on the one hand, it seems to pander to their desire to not be as restricted. And so he intentionally dispenses with the informer statute that had caused so much trouble at William and Mary. And it's made quite clear that no student will be compelled to give any testimony unless he chooses to on his own honor. Also, there's the creation of something called a Board of Censors, in which the students seem to have some authority over judging their peers and inflicting some sort of punishments on them for minor infractions. So in almost every feature of the creation of the University of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson is reflecting upon this common problem of student turmoil, particularly associated with young Southern men who have been raised to be the masters of slaves. It would be put to the test in the very first year of UVA, and Jefferson's hopes to control those students would all be shattered, particularly in the riots that break out right at the end of September and the start of October in 1825, and would demonstrate that this culture of honor associated with slavery was very deeply rooted and would require a much longer period and some different sort of administration in order to restrict it in any way than was possible in Jefferson's lifetime. Thank you.
shorn of any of the notions of human equality that surely only come from Judeo-Christianity, why wouldn't you expect to see a recurrence of the agonic struggle of the classical age? I mean, what these students are doing is exactly what, it's the agoge of Sparta.
Right.
I mean, why wouldn't you expect that to happen?
Well, one figure, and he's somebody who's come up in a couple of the talks, is John Holt Rice, who is the great Presbyterian leader in Virginia. And he's somebody who supports the creation of the University of Virginia. He supports it because he's playing a long game. And he doesn't like what Jefferson stands for, though he tries to play nice with Jefferson. They exchange polite notes, but they each understands the other pretty well, that there's going to be a struggle for the soul of this institution. And Rice is a great believer in discipline, and he's a believer that you can't have discipline without religion. And his great supporter on the Board of Visitors is John Hartwell Cock. And once Jefferson dies, the visitors will become much more under the influence of Cock. And the pendulum will swing very strongly in that direction. And so Maury mentioned about the uniforms and so forth. Those uniforms don't come in until Jefferson's dead. It's October of 1826 that they're introduced. And part of it is to try to reduce conspicuous consumption among the students. They also try to lock up their money so that there's a very limited amount of spending cash that they will have. They try to restrict them to staying on grounds. There's a whole variety of ways. A real clampdown comes in, a very repressive regime is introduced in October of 1826, and then it gets tightened in the next couple of years. Again, Cock is always pushing it, with a little bit of pushback from Madison and Cabell. But essentially, Cock is now the closest one and the most energetic. So the university, you can say in some senses, has two founders. There's Jefferson and then there's Cock. And Cock doesn't get as much attention as he should get. And Cock is really struggling to reshape this institution in a different way. And the consequences is the number of students that will come here shrinks, because they don't want to go to Cox University. They want to go to Jefferson's University, but not to Cox. And so, and then it becomes a long tangled tale of what's going to happen after that. But I'm going to end the story with Cox's efforts to reshape it along the lines that his friend John Holt Rice has had in mind for the university. Yeah, Maury.
Thank you for that, Alan. Can you talk a little bit about the decision made both at UVA and a number of other Southern institutions, but not all, to not let students bring servants?
Right. Well, that's part of the conspicuous consumption thing. So they just think, in part, there's limited space. You know, Jefferson has designed something that really packs students in. There's limited space to put slaves. And so the decision is made that it will be, you know, it'll maintain greater equality among the students if they are dependent on the services of the slaves that are owned by the hotel keepers. But that makes the hotel keepers then kind of the center of lots of conflict at the university. So it's just kind of displacing where the violence will be directed in the conflict. So in the second year of the university, the chief forum for conflict is the hotels. And it's, you know, students on slaves, but it's also students behaving in ways with the tacit encouragement of these hotel keepers who have to compete for students. They want to make the students happy. It turns out students are happier if they can go and drink and gamble at a hotel than if they can't. So the resorting to the private market, which Jefferson thinks is a great solution to the problems that universities have when they try to be the single provider of food and slave services, actually just displaces the conflict in a different way. Andrew. Okay.
In their book, Vinette and Peter, they have a wonderful, almost throwaway line in which they say that Jefferson in many ways idealized Northerners rather than Southerners as the ideal citizens, the yeoman farmers, the town meetings. And one of the most powerful paragraphs in the notes is when Jefferson talks about the corrupting influence of slavery on whites and the sort of white child that behaves from very early age like a tyrant and has this sense of entitlement. We know Jefferson disliked his fellow students at William and Mary. He abhorred the gambling, the frivolity, and he was distraught by the riots in the university. And I have to say, as an Oxford alumnus, that the students were rioting against what they called in Latin Cambridge fanatics. Is one of the ironies of the University of Virginia that the students were not what Jefferson really wanted, that he'd be almost ashamed of a man like Boyd, who Owen talked about, and that what he really had in mind were very studious, rather serious, middling students, and that he himself saw slavery as an abomination and was not attracted to his fellow planter class.
He always has a deep ambivalence, I would say, or as my amigo would say, he's deeply conflicted about the Virginia planters and their way of life. He, very interesting letters that he writes later, I think to Thomas Jefferson Randolph, saying essentially going away to school rescued me from this hedonistic culture that I otherwise would have just wallowed in and I would have amounted to nothing. And the implication is that most young Virginians, despite their advantages, amounted to nothing because they wallowed in this hedonism. So he is, of course, very studious, very self-disciplined throughout his life. And it makes him kind of one of a kind in Virginia. I mean, maybe there are a handful of others that might be able to match the self-discipline that he had. I think it was a challenge for him to understand people who couldn't do what he did. And so he thinks that if he gets the buildings just right and the rules just right and the professors just right, you can bring Virginians in one end of the process, and rather quickly they'll adapt and they'll be studious, but they'll still be Virginians. Because, and this came up I think in Maury's and probably in Lewis's presentation, maybe some others, one of the prime purposes of UVA is to keep Virginians from going to northern institutions. If what you really want to do is turn them into Yankees, you send them off to Harvard and Yale and tell them to obey the rules. But they don't want that to happen. They want to try to reform Virginians subtly, sufficiently that they'll work hard, but not so much that they'll want to challenge the institutional infrastructure of the state in radical ways. Yes, sir.
Is there a relationship between Jefferson's distaste for this kind of behavior and his interest in creating a path for people who are not part of that class into the university?
Well, again, nobody gets more credit for proposals that he writes than Thomas Jefferson. Okay. He's gotten a lot of mileage out of his 1778, 1779 plan, which never gets implemented, which says some of the right things. One of the ironies of the University of Virginia is that he spends all of the money he can get and then some on buildings, which means when it goes into operation, there are no scholarships. And it is the most expensive university in the world. So it means the only people who can go to the University of Virginia are coming from the planter class. And there are many members of the planter class who write letters who, in fact, were saying it's too expensive. And there's one of them, I think, it might be William Cabell, who actually decides, I'm going to send another son back to William and Mary because UVA is too expensive. So, and it contrasts with a proposal for the University of Virginia that St. George Tucker came up with, in which he was going to create a fund that would be progressive and over the years would keep building scholarships. And so he wanted the state to invest a lot in that and not much in buildings. He was trying to economize on buildings. So ultimately, the university will follow what Jefferson proposes, which leaves us with some beautiful, very important buildings. But in his own time, it meant that the alternative of providing a lot of scholarships didn't happen. And there are social consequences from that, because it's a one-class institution, and it's the one class that causes the most trouble when you put them all together in this hothouse environment. Yeah, Mark.
Thanks. I guess my question is, when I'm reading in the North, the institution I notice that's most concerned about discipline is the New York African Free School, because they want to prove that these freed slaves can be capable citizens. And one of the things they like to say is, look how good we're doing. None of these kids end up incarcerated or something like that. And I'm wondering just if you've ever seen in northern newspapers the sort of stories of the African Free School counterposed with some of the chaos in the Virginia universities, or if you see sort of anti-slavery activists in the North who are behind the African Free School making kind of anti-slavery arguments out of what's going on in Virginia.
Well, one of my limitations these days is I just read Virginia newspapers, and I guarantee you they are not reporting those stories. Jeff?
Two things. About Jefferson's proposals and the credit for being interested in scholarships for people. The bill that he proposes that doesn't pass, the kind of the broad one in about 1816, that he includes proposals to get some men of talents out of the poorer people. When we first looked, I was astonished by how limited it was. I mean, it's like every 4 years you get to propose somebody in each district, and the overall number of people involved would be so tiny.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to see how it would have any real effect,
Right.
except, maybe you manage to dredge up a Newton or something, but you're not going to have a real effect on society with that,
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
that proposal. And the other was just a sort of a comment that occurred to me when you were talking about Jefferson's interest in dispersing the students from a big building as partly a way of boiling them down to where they were easier to control because they weren't all in one place. If I'm remembering correctly, one of Jefferson's objections to the anti-slavery proposals to limit expansion of slavery at the time of the Missouri Compromise is he's saying, look, if you want to get rid of slavery, you guys are going about it the wrong way, because slavery will end if you can just spread them all out all over the place, or at least the
Right.
threat of it will. So around the same time, he's using the same kind of delusional argument in both cases, that if you spread them out a bit, the whole problem will go away.
Well, I would argue that the design of the university, and I've lost my image now. I don't know if it's able to recover it. But the dispersion, the whole thing is a microcosm of his political view. In that each pavilion is supposed to be equivalent in size, just as each of the states is supposed to have equivalent authority, rather than some states having more power than others. And the rotunda is essentially a symbol of the union of the states, as a meeting place where these equal states can come together, except it's a meeting place for these equal professors to come together, and the students are all to be dispersed in ways. So there are ways in which Jefferson's thinking, and this is something where I'm very indebted to my amigo, Pedro, operates in constructing these very kind of complex systems of layers in which everything's interlocked. And the university, I think, in its architectural design is a reflection of that mode of thinking. Yeah?
I apologize if this is okay, too incidental, or I might have missed it, but the two students at the beginning of your talk who were dueling at William and Mary,
Yeah.
you said that they were disagreeing over the pronunciation of a term or a word.
A word, yeah.
What word was that?
I have no idea.
Oh, okay.
If somebody can tell me, I would love to know. But Randolph often throughout his life disputed with people on the pronunciation of many words. Yeah. John?
Thank you for all this. I was interested in your answers to Andrew, which is to say he doesn't want to make Yankees. He wants to make Jeffersonians. He wants to make little Jeffersons. But tying that to the problem with Koch and with Rice, who you're pointing out are not particularly Jeffersonian in many ways, and they have this outsized influence after Jefferson's dead. Could you extend that to Cabell? Because Cabell's an interesting guy.
Yeah,
He's
he
not
is.
particularly Jeffersonian, but yet he's very Jeffersonian on education, and he is the third and fifth rector. So could you add about Cabell?
Well, this is, what have we got in this room? We've got about 100 people. We've probably got 100 different definitions of what Jeffersonian means, right? I mean, it's an elusive term. So often Jeffersonian means, usually in the context, it means something that we like, right? And so Mark, in his great presentation, was talking about these Jeffersonians, but they turn out they're all in the North, in establishing these schools that will provide social mobility. There's nothing in the William and Mary, in the UVA that goes into operation in 1825 that is going to provide social mobility. You could say, and I think one could say, that in our use of the word Jeffersonian to mean providing social mobility, the greatest Jeffersonian in Virginia is John Holt Rice. He's the champion of the middle class. He's the champion of social mobility for that middle class, but he is frankly contemptuous of poor whites. He thinks most of them just won't work hard enough to advance themselves and prefer to drink. So many of the things that we associate with, which we call Jeffersonian, and that we primarily find in the North, you can actually find there are champions of it, and one of the chief champions, I would say, is John Holt Rice. Yeah, Maureen.
Could I just add a footnote, since people do seem a little interested in this question of scholarships and state students and social mobility. The university does get around to it. It takes them about 20 years, but the idea doesn't die. And they create a series of scholarships for students, again, by senatorial district. And they're referred to usually in the records as the state students. And by the 1850s, it's about 1/3 of UVA's student body. And for those of you who know the term Dawson's Row from UVA, there was a series of about 6 buildings built where all the state students were housed together. So they were kind of cordoned off. They also lived up on Monroe Hill. So they had their own kind of like specialized housing that was cheaper to board at than the hotels or the other boarding houses in town. But the idea does eventually come to fruition in UVA.
Yes, Johan.
So, thank you. So, building on John's question or Cam's question, I can't see that, but there's a pillar. But it seems to me you came at this from a social, cultural perspective to explain why there are particular internal rules and architecture at UVA. But at the heart of it is this political project of making Virginia Republican and Jefferson's vision of republicanism. And it seems to me that the political side of that story, we've seen in some of the other presentations how he needs to stay in the background, is that Jefferson doesn't have a lot of political capital in his own state at this point. That his part, the Republican Party, is not very Jeffersonian. So he's trying to find a way to create an elite, kind of behind the scenes, that will meet the needs of Jeffersonianism with his own party, or the party that he would be affiliated with, the Republicans, are not very much sided with Jefferson himself. Is that true?
I would say it's half true. Okay. Again, what does it mean to be Jeffersonian? In what sense are the Republicans of Virginia not Jefferson? He's revered by people like Thomas Ritchie. And Thomas Ritchie is the great power broker in the state. He's the editor of the Richmond Enquirer. And anytime Jefferson wants to publish something in there, I mean, many of these great documents that we've been talking about here, the letter to Peter Carr, the Rockfish Gap report, all these things, they get published. And a lot of times it's a clever game in which, yes, he wants to have kind of deniability, but when Cabell says, I need a trump card to play, it's going to be something, it's going to be a document in Jefferson's hand. So there are times, yes, when he wants to mask it and have somebody else submit it and even copy it over. But there are lots of times where Cabell will go and get a few members, influential members of the legislature together and put out, and they see Jefferson's handwriting here, see the signature. And he says, that works like magic. So Jefferson has a lot of clout. But the thing about Jefferson is he hates to burn up political capital. And he's constantly calculating how he can get what he wants without burning up political capital. And so the whole slavery thing, he's not going to burn up political capital over that. And there are ways in which he's constantly calibrating, trying to get him, make sure that he's still going along with Spencer Roane and Thomas Ritchie and the real keepers of the orthodoxy. So the fact that Jefferson is so anti-Supreme Court, so anti-anything consolidationist, so anti the Missouri Compromise, all that stuff is making sure he's on board with the so-called Richmond junta and running the... Now, the great area where they split is over constitutional reform and whether or not the electorate's going to, the white male electorate's going to be expanded. And Jefferson is on board with reform efforts there, and that just appalls the orthodox Republicans. But that's the only major area I can think of where there is a divergence and where they're not inclined to listen to him. Thanks.
So Peter Onuf used to accuse me of anti-intellectualism when I would stop forums on time. I remain unrepentant because I love to see an audience leave still gasping for more. And I apologize to Alan for preventing him from going on for another 8 hours. But he and his fellow presenters have far exceeded my expectations with what I think has been a wonderful conference. But I want to thank the two people who've been most important to its success. Firstly, Whitney Pippin, my assistant, and also Mary Scott Fleming, if she's here, who's the head of our outreach programs. What they share in common is a love of the sort of academic life. Unlike me, they're not anti-intellectual. Thank you.